Welcome to Raven Talk, the official podcast of the Raven Tribe. The Raven Tribe is a home for warriors on the path, and is dedicated to training warriors for the battlefield of life. Visit us on the web at theraventribe.com, where you can learn more information on membership, warrior training, as well as links to our official YouTube channel, Facebook group, apparel store, and our official bookstore, Marshall Books.
Welcome back, Tribe. We're here again with special guest Stith. Today we're going to be discussing the Afro-Brazilian martial art of Capoeira. Damon, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm honored and happy to be back.
Great. Well, we're glad to have you back. And Damon, for the audience at home that may have missed your previous episode, I recommend that you do check it out. But can you give us a little bit of information about yourself, just a little bit about your background in the Afro-Caribbean martial arts and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Okay. Well, I started off doing martial arts when I was a kid at the age of 6. Formally started training at 9 in Shorin-ryu Karate Do. And from that point, I was always kind of looking for, a style or an expression that best suited me. And, I went through a couple of transitions, from, Okinawan hard style karate to kung fu to jeet kune do and then to the Southeast Asian arts. And it was really from, I guess my encounter with the Southeast Asian arts that kind of opened me up for the African arts and then specifically with capoeira. So I started doing capoeira when I was around 17, and most of my study was was independent study. There was no teacher that I was aware of around me, so I started picking up the practice on my own in the best way that I could. And over the years, training with the community that eventually grew here in my city, and then training with other mestres and other adepts at the art. It became a part of my life and a part of my martial expression. So now I'm, not to date myself, but 23 years later, not that long actually. I'm not sure, my math is off, but 20 years later, here I am, taking capoeira as my base art, and I primarily practice the style of capoeira that's referred to as Angola, which is the more traditional of the two styles. And we'll get into that when we're talking about the art and its history. But my expression has been mostly, or my study has been mostly along those lines as far as capoeira is concerned.
Now, Damon, can you tell us a little bit about the history of capoeira? I've heard conflicting stories, and it kind of depends on who you ask. But what is your understanding of the history of where this art came from?
Okay, that's a great question, and that is the question. And before I start, this is my opinion based on my research and my understanding of the art. First, let me say that the popular folk answer to that question, and I say folk because it's kind of it's kind of, we don't know where this theory is developed from, but it seems to have caught be pretty widespread. But the quick answer to the question is that capoeira is an African Brazilian martial art that was brought to Brazil during the slave trade. The slaves couldn't practice their martial arts openly, so they disguised it as dance and ritual movements and added acrobatics to it in order to hide it from the slave masters, and music as well. So this theory, it holds a lot of weight because of what we understand of how in the African diaspora how our traditions had to survive. They had to survive and be disguised as other things. We know about Candomblé and Santeria, where African deities were worshipped alongside of Catholic saints, and that form of syncretism was what enabled these traditions to survive, in parts of Latin America. We also know that using this type of malicia, this type of trickery, to kind of achieve a greater goal is pretty common in the African diaspora. Even like in North America, you think about the old spirituals where the slaves were singing about the fall of the dipping gourd, and that was actually seen as just as a very innocent, benign song, but it was actually given very explicit directions on how runaway slaves can make it to their freedom. So we have in the tradition of the diaspora, this theory holds a lot of weight because it's very familiar to what we've already experienced. From my research and from my understanding, that although this theory is pretty strong, it's not correct. It's not accurate. One of the reasons being is that when this art form, so let's just start with the beginning. So the root and the seed of this art form descends from West and Central Africa, specifically in Central Africa. The best theories I've heard to explain why capoeira is the way it is today, it all links to its connection to Central African cosmology and Central African training for warrior training. It fits all of that. To me, it aligns mostly with that. So with that being said, the root of it, in my opinion, comes from Central Africa, originally from Central Africa. And then as more slaves from different areas were introduced into Brazil and, started to become practitioners of this art, they started to add different layers to it as well. We can see that in the musical instruments that are used in capoeira. So most Congo-based traditions in the diaspora, one telltale sign that it's a Congo-based tradition is that the drum is played they play the drum in a transverse manner. If you look at Damier and Lajda from Martinique, you'll notice that the drum, when I mean by transverse, the drum is laid on the side, the person sits on top of the drum and they play the drum in that way. If you notice the drum in capoeira, it's played more like the way that the Yoruba will play the drum, where it's upright and rhythm, it's off the ground and standing. So we start off with capoeira now, and I'm sorry, I'm all over the place, but one of the early depictions of capoeira in art is a drawing that depicts a man, one drum, sitting on the drum in a transverse fashion, playing the drum while two individuals, play they play capoeira. This scene looks very much like, Martinique very much like Lajda from Martinique or like Mani. Looks very different than what we associate with capoeira. There's no berimbau, there's no atabaque, there's the atabaque, but there's no pandero, there's none of the other instruments that we associated with modern capoeira. So leads us to believe that in the beginning, only the drum was the main instrument, and it was played in the fashion that the Congolese play their drums. So then later on, we have other instruments that are integrated into the space of capoeira. We have the berimbau, which is another Central African instrument, and then we get the agogo, which is the iron cowbell, which is a Yoruba instrument, and the heku, which is a bamboo scraper, and then the drum ceases to be played in a sideways fashion, but now it's played in an upright fashion, and this coincides with the introduction of more Yoruba into Brazil, or more people from that area into Brazil, and their influence being played into the art of capoeira. So, and even with candomblé, it's the same thing. The term candomblé is derived from, a Congolese term, but we know that candomblé has, a majority of Yoruba deities in it. And this is like the Yoruba deities are built on the foundation of a Congolese foundation. So like in capoeira, the game, the movements, I believe it's the same thing. The base of it came from Congo, and it was later built upon by, other groups that were introduced into that ritual space. A part of the reason why I don't believe that, another reason why I don't believe that the art was just like that, the music and the dance and the acrobatics were just kind of more incidental, is because these things that we see inside the hall, even though they don't have a lot of martial application. They have a lot of spiritual and tactical information that they reveal to the practitioners. Even from where if we go back to Congolese style of warfare, drums being used to signal certain patterns, certain movements on the battlefield, you find the same pattern. You find the same concept that's applied in the Harda, in Capoeira, and in Damier and other forms as well, where the drumming patterns relay a certain idea. So that with the music, there's a very, very important tactical information that's being given to the players, and the players are interacting with the music as much as the music is interacting with them. For me, that kind of connection seems too strong to be just like an incidental thing. Something it's too strong to be, well, hey, let's just disguise this and make this seem like we're not doing something. The music has a very deep, profound connection to the movement. The same thing can be said with the acrobatic movements that are done in capoeira. When we view the old theory and say, okay, they just added some flips and backflips in just to kind of throw the masters off, it's like, okay, whatever. But when we view this from the Congolese or from the Kikongo concept of the sacred cross, or my gosh, it's escaping me right now, the term, and people are going to kill me, the Kalunga, excuse me. When we understand the concept of the Kalunga, we know that in Congolese spirituality, the world is envisioned as being on a cross. The top portion of that cross represents the land of the living. The bottom portion of the cross represents the land of the deceased, and it's a mirror world to the world of the land of the living. So whenever, a practitioner inverts their head, they're seen as like walking in a spiritual realm. They're seen as, deriving strength and power from that unseen world that mirrors our world. And again, it's like this kind of acrobatic flourish, it seems to me more than just, hey, let's just throw some flips in just for the sake of it. These inversions have meaning, even though you won't necessarily use an inversion in combat situation. But there's like a spiritual meaning that's going on while I'm inverting myself. And to me, those connections make it seems too powerful to be something that just kind of developed out of the mere need of survival. And then one more thing along these lines, and then I'll shut up for a second. But another thing is how the game is played itself parallels how Congolese warriors were trained. Big focus is on evasion, dynamic evasion at that, slipping, dodging. And one reason that's been put forward by scholars such as like John K. Thornton and of course Professor T.J. Desch is that in Central African warfare at the time, there was a very brief phase where projectile weapons were used, whether it's casting spears, shooting arrows or whatnot. And after that, what would happen is that the parties would engage and fight, in close quarters. And the way that they arranged themselves in battle was in these open lines, one, to make their ranks larger so that they would, easily avoid being hit by the projectile, and two, so that when they got into the position to actually fight in close quarters, they could move about. And that was like one of their main forms of defense, was being able to dodge and avoid the attacks of edged and concussion weapons. This same principle of dynamic evasion, of slipping, dodging, changing levels, you see the same principle played out quite frequently in capoeira, where you don't block attacks, you dodge, you evade, you slip, you flow, you redirect. You see the same kind of concept kind of played out within the art itself, even though the circumstances in which it flourished may have altered it in a bit.
No, Damon, let me ask you this, because I've heard the argument that capoeira is uniquely Brazilian. in the sense that it only exists in this form in Brazil. That if you go back to its origin in Africa, you won't find an art that looks like this. What are your thoughts on that? How much of an influence and how much evolution do you think occurred in Brazil as opposed to coming over as a complete art to the Americans?
Well, that's a tricky thing, because the capoeira is a living art, and it's so for example, the capoeira today that's practiced today isn't the same capoeira that was practiced in the 1800s in Brazil itself. And vice versa, that capoeira isn't necessarily the same one that was practiced maybe 100 or so years before that. So there is an evolution that occurs with the art, depending on what its circumstances are, and what it at the time feels it needs to survive and continue. Now, if I were to we'll take Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example. Jiu is seen as just that, as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? But is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu really any different than traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu? Not terribly. They have a different focus, which is using the ground and fighting from the ground. But I mean, all of the base root stuff that was part of Japanese, even ground fighting that you find in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is still found in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. So it doesn't take away from the fact that the Brazilians have innovated Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, traditional Jiu-Jitsu, but it's still Jiu-Jitsu. Capoeira is the same thing, and it kind of makes it unfair to answer this, because our research on the continent is so limited that we can't say for certain, what was there before. At the same time, there's no pinpointing theme that says that capoeira is from this specific area and from this specific groups. So again, it's like we're really trying to find a needle that's in the haystack. With that being said, there was a gentleman from Angola in the 60s who was traveling to Brazil, and he saw Brazilian capoeira, and he made an automatic connection between capoeira and the Angola dance that's practiced in his country. And he drew sketches of the Angola dance and kind of broke down some of the phases. So that was in the 60s, and this is back in the 60s. So now, where we're at, there are mestres now that have gone back to Angola, and there's a mestre Cobra. He's come out with I'm not sure where he's at, if it's been released yet, but he's actually found. Well, I should say Professor T.J. Obi Desh has been a strong proponent of the idea that capoeira has Central African connections and roots, and he's accredited with finding one of the parent arts of capoeira, Angola dance. Okay, and his theories have been around, since the maybe late 80s, early 90s. So now we are at the point where Mr. Cobra and a few other guys, they've actually traveled to Angola. They've actually videoed and filmed, I don't want to say tribesmen, but men that are connected to the culture that still practice Angola and can make a comparison between capoeira and Angola. And yes, they see that their art form, that what is being done in Brazil is descendant from what they do now. And, it shows them throwing some of the similar kicks, some of the similar type of movements. It's amazing to see that. Now, erase all that or put that to the side. Forget that we even have that stuff now. If you just look at the diaspora, if you look at the arts that are practiced in the East African diaspora, Morengue, you look at Damier and Laja, you look at Mani, you're going to see a comparison. You're going to see a similar style of movement. evasions, inverted kicking. You're going to see also the same kind of structure as far as like a circular arena that consists of practitioners as well as spectators. The emphasis on the music plays on the fight. The whole structure of the event, how it's used to either mark important rites of passage, to mark certain seasons, how the art is used as a way to kind of, how should I say, alleviate certain social issues. So it's like it's a chance for young men, and more so in the past than now, it was a chance for young men to kind of show their skill, bravery, establish themselves as strong and intelligent amongst their peers, and also a way to attract the opposite sex. I mean, the way that capoeira functions in Brazil, it still functions as other African martial arts, on the continent. And I mean, for me, I haven't had anyone offer enough evidence for me to make me think that any different. Now, the evolution of the art, it's not to say that there aren't techniques or movements that may have been adapted from other places. That's kind of like the constant theme. But I think that the purpose of the game, the structure of it, the spirit of it, and the strategies of it, are the same. And, then to me, the evidence in the diaspora and then this new evidence that we found on the continent, reflects that.
Now, Damon,
and there's other dances. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. You mentioned Angola, and you're talking about how they're looking to Angola for the roots. Now, in Brazil, Capoeira Angola is one of the two major styles of Capoeira. Can you explain to me the difference between the major groupings of Capoeira in Brazil? Okay.
Another good question. So you're going to get me in a lot of trouble for this interview.
Nice.
So capoeira used to be practiced in other parts of Brazil. So let's start with where capoeira is now. So all modern capoeira comes from, one specific place in Brazil. And that's Salvador Bahia, from Bahia, the state of Bahia. And that's in the northeastern portion of Brazil, has a very, very strong African presence there. A very, very strong African presence there. Before that, there were two other major centers of capoeira. So there was Bahia, which was one. In Rio, the capital at the time, there was another. Excuse me. In Recife, also in the northeast, there was another center. Now, these areas when I say this, there were other places where capoeira was also practiced, or some kind of, I guess before it was all coined as capoeira, there were other regional ritual fights that were practiced by people of African descent. Sao Paulo was another place, but the main areas are usually Bahia, Rio, and Recife. So in Recife and in Rio, the capoeira there was the practitioners were very much in opposition to the government. And not to say this wasn't the case in Bahia, but it was very, very intense in Rio. There were wars being fought between capoeiristas and against the government. And the government has always had kind of like this love-hate relationship with capoeira because, one, it's like and all this stuff is kind of tying back into each other. But one thing is capoeira was used, or these kind of practices were encouraged amongst the slaves because it allowed them to maintain their ethnic rivalries. And then it reached a point where those rivalries became infectious to like the middle class and the upper class, and started attracting them. I should say these rivalries, but the art form started attracting more of the upper class and the middle class to them, and they they were seen as dangerous, and they started to become outlawed. So capoeira was outlawed along with other African expressions. Going back to that old theory, so you couldn't really hide an African martial art and an African dance, because when they were outlawed, they were both outlawed at the same time. So in Rio, there was lots of fighting going on between, groups of capoeiristas and between capoeiristas and the government and the different political parties. And a lot of capoeiristas were used as strongmen for certain political parties. This back and forth, violence kind of created the capoeira in Rio was a lot more, I guess street oriented in its descriptions. We don't know how it really existed in a ritual sense, but we do get a lot of encounters of it, in opposition to, fighting with the police or fighting with soldiers and stuff like that. So there was, like I said, needless to say that there was a serious repression of capoeira in Rio, to the point where the government was actually using other capoeiristas to betray their fellow practitioners of the art. And it was a serious witch hunt. And a lot of people that were hunting down capoeiristas, they were capoeiristas themselves. So under those kind of circumstances, the capoeira, eventually started to die out. In Recife, the same thing. The capoeira was very closely associated with the gangs or the paramilitary groups that were, associated with the poor and with the people of African descent. And same thing. Eventually, it got quelled, and it went underground and eventually disappeared. So in Bahia, similar thing, of course, repression from the government, but the capoeira managed to survive. I'm not exactly sure. Perhaps it was by adding or playing up this different element to the art, or it could have been just purely by chance. But a lot of the practitioners were sent out to fight in the wars, where a lot of them died, and with the intent of making use of the capoeiristas to kind of fight these battles, at the same time by also getting rid of a problem, because capoeira was seen as not just as as a martial art, but it was seen as something that low class, poor, degenerate people would do, and it was kind of seen as something that had to be cleansed. And that was one of the ways they decided to cleanse it, was by offering freedom. If you go fight in the war in Paraguay, cross the Paranaway River, and you get your freedom. And that's why one of the most famous capoeira songs is Paranaway. That's what they're talking about. It's go to cross the Paraná River, fight in this battle, and then you come back, you're free. You're a free man. Anyhow, so however, the capoeira in Bahia was able to survive by being maybe more flexible, by being less rigidly opposed to the government, or just by going more underground. So this is all, like I said, in the late 1800s, early 19th century. Capoeira is still around in Bahia. It's pretty much died out in the other places, and this is where we get to that golden age, what we recognize as modern capoeira. So all modern capoeira comes from Bahia right now. And two mestres emerged as the pinnacle of these two different styles. So the traditional style, like I said before, is referred to as Capoeira Angola, and then the newer style was created by a mestre Bimba called Capoeira Regional. So in the 1930s, there was a mestre named Mestre Bimba who, according to the stories, he wanted to uplift the image of capoeira and showcase it as a legitimate, form of fight, a legitimate, form of exercise. And this is like, during the right time for in Brazil's history, because at this time they're searching for, they have a large influx of foreign immigrants, a lot of them from Japan and from other parts of Europe, and they're really trying to establish this sense of Brazilianness. So they're like their fighting arts in these respective immigrant communities are kind of pitted against each other. This is like the origins of Vale Tudo. This is the origins of the UFC and the mixed martial arts as we know it today. And this is like the origins of the Gracies too, because their, instructor was one that was part of this influx of immigrants from Japan. So, Capoeira was kind of hoped to be like this Brazilian national sport. But the problem was that it was like too much associated with people of African descent, of slaves and of lowlives and of criminals. So there had been attempts to kind of take Capoeira, take aspects of Capoeira and make it more, palatable to what the government felt would be a sport worthy of representing Brazil. It started by a mestre named Anibal. I'm not sure. I can't remember exactly how many years before Mestre Bimba he started to do his thing, but he wanted to create this capoeira. He saw promise in capoeira, and he wanted to promote it as a Brazilian national sport. So Mestre Bimba, kind of falling in in that time period, in that atmosphere, he decided to take advantage of that. And he combined his Capoeira Angola that he had learned and that he was a mestre of with another fighting art that was practiced by blacks in Brazil called Batuque. Batuque was a form of it was like all leg sweeps and trips. So the story is that he combined Batuque with Capoeira Angola to create Capoeira Regional. And he took some things away that were done in Capoeira Angola, and he's been kind of criticized for doing that, for kind of whitening the art. He changed the instruments that were used. Excuse me. He went to using just one beating bowl and two panderos. Panderos are the tambourines, and he took away the atabaque and the drum and the iron bell. These things were closely associated with people of African descent and with African religions and such like that. So he took those things out of it. The way he played, a lot of the traditional mestres didn't like that because they felt that it was like he was, going against the tradition of Angola. With that being said, as Capoeira Regional was kind of gaining attention, because he was the first one to actually get to open a school in 1937, because of his alignment and because of his movement, and because of the desire to create capoeira, to show capoeira as a bona fide fighting art and as a true sport. He had the backing of the leadership in Brazil, and they allowed him to open a school in 1937. Maybe about 5 years later, another very prominent mestre from Bahia, Mestre Pashinha, he became the rallying point for all the traditional mestres that were playing in a traditional style, and they kind of band together and created the identity of Capoeira Angola. Now there's some debates on whether, like when you ask Angoleros, people that play Capoeira Angola, Capoeira Angola is like seen as a traditional style, and they're seen as like always has been the way it is. In my opinion, I kind of feel that Capoeira Angola and Capoeira Regional, they kind of developed their identities kind of roughly at the same time, where there was this traditional form of play in the area. There wasn't really like one like simple, easy name and identity for what it was. And you get people that criticize Mestre Bimba for playing too fast and too upright. Then you have other mestres who were who were around this time that said that, hey, you know, in capoeira you can play fast, you can play slow, you can play high, you can play low. So there's like these differing ideas of what capoeira was. There's different modalities. Anyhow, I believe that the idea of capoeira Angola as a traditional style developed as it was, you know, developed alongside as Regional was developing.
And do you feel?
Sorry.
Do you feel that as a practitioner of capoeira, you need to study both to get both sides of the coin to really understand the art?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you would ask me when I was younger, I would say yes. I mean, where I'm at now is no. Like, I think that you need to figure out like what you want from capoeira, and then that's what's going to decide which way you go. Because to me, it's like they really aren't any different from each other. I mean, they're different. When we say there's two styles, there's as many styles as there are, you know, really good players. So it's like you find out what you want from the art, and then that's what's going to lead you to your group and to your style. You know, some people want to train capoeira as a martial art, and I'm not saying they necessarily go to do capoeira regional is the best way to go, but it depends on how you view that, on how you view what you want from capoeira. Some people just want to play capoeira because they like the exercise, they like the feeling of the movements, they like the music, they like the tradition, they like these other things. And the art is big enough to accommodate that. I would say that it's important for people that play capoeira regional or contemporary capoeira to play Angola, because there's a lot of really old wisdom that's associated with it. And to me, you know, since their main mestre came from, you know, capoeira Angola, from the traditional movement, then it's important to also know, to better understand your mestre. I think it's wise to understand like where he came from. So I would say if anyone should study both, it would be people that practice contemporary capoeira Angola. I mean contemporary capoeira contemporânea or capoeira regional.
Now, Damon, let me ask you: in capoeira, we see a lot of empty hand fighting. Is weaponry part of the art? Because it's something I haven't seen much of, but I have seen you perform it. So can you give us a little bit of insight as far as where the weaponry comes in and how it's utilized?
Yeah. So, weaponry in capoeira, like I said in the past, there were a lot more there were more modalities within the art. There were certain beating bow tokes, beating bow rhythms that indicated like this was a game where we fought with knives. There were images of malandros in Brazil. Malandros being for lack of a better term, they were hustlers, and you know, guys that could handle themselves on the streets. There's these images of these malandros, and they are like kind of showcasing like, you know, capoeira. And in one image, it shows you know, the low leg sweep. You know, the guy's in the sweep, and while this guy's going for the sweep, there's another image of a guy that's showing like what they call a tapana, which is an open palm slap strike. And then in the other two images, it shows well, actually there's more. There's like, it shows a headbutt, and then it shows like this kick. But then the real telling one is that it shows like the guy fighting with a straight razor, and then another guy fighting with a stick. In the past, the stick, the straight razor, the knife, you know, were tools that were used by capoeiristas. Now, it's not to say that they were necessarily used inside the roda, but they were things that they were practiced and they were do. And then, according to some of the theories and some of the rhythms, that there was probably a point where some of this stuff was used in a more ritualized setting. Actually, there's a film with Mestre João Pequeno and João Grande, and they're playing inside the roda. And this is probably in the 50s. They're playing in the roda, and both of these guys are armed with knives, and they're not fighting with knives between their toes or whatever else. They have knives in their hands, and they're playing these weapons, with these knives. So I think that at some point in time, this was a part of the art, and it's one of those things that I think that this was like one of the sacrifices that Capoeira had to make in order to gain that public space. Because, like I said before, it was illegal to practice, and then even when it was legal, even when you were allowed to openly open a school, you had to have certain permits to do it, and especially do it out, like playing out in the open and such. And I think that one of the issues that the government has had with Capoeira is that there was, when you get these different groups that would like engage with each other, or there would be scuffles, there would be fights. So I think that the weapons and some of the harder play was played down in order for the art to gain the social space it needed to survive.
Now, Damon, speaking of that social space, I mean, I find it to be a real unique kind of dynamic here where, and I'm sure you've heard this over the years, but people that teach self-defense, teach maybe more combat-oriented martial arts, will often be critical of Capoeira and say, well, it looks pretty, but that's really acrobatic, and are you going to do that stuff in the street? But Capoeira, in its history, was something that was used by street toughs, and it was something that was part of that element. I mean, you had guys that were enforcers, using this in the street. So it's a little bit ironic that something that has its origins in the street becomes so, poorly respected as a street fighting art in our culture now.
And not just only in the streets, but on the battlefield. The Zuawas battalion, they were the guys that had to go into the trenches and engage in close quarter fighting in the trenches. These guys were fighting in close quarters, in trenches, with whatever weapons that they had at hand. And it's like, it is a very, very very, very far cry from where we're at today, where, even thinking about Capoeira being illegal, it's like people ask me why, why would someone make this illegal to do? And it's like, it's that darker side that we don't see, because now we see it as more, as a health movement than anything else. Hold on one second. Yes, baby. Okay, I got you. So, go ahead. I'll get it. Sorry. So yeah, I think that it is very ironic, how much it has, how much, it's almost like you say it, it's and I have to stop myself too sometimes from thinking it. It's well, no one really believes that this was, what it was used for at the time, but yeah, I mean, very much so.
And Damon,
you got.
I was going to say, before we wrap up, I'd like to get your thoughts on, how to make sure that your capoeira is combat ready. If somebody is training in capoeira and they're learning, either Angola or regional, how do they, ensure that they have the right perspective to make that art function for them for real self-defense?
Okay. That's a great question. What I do for myself is, one, we have to realize that we have to first things first is you have to separate the roda from the streets. So when we play capoeira, we're inside the roda. That's ritual space. That's where we are in a very sacred space that we're engaging in. That's very, very different than the way we're engaging on the street. So there's certain things that you do. There's certain prohibitions inside the roda that you things you can't do that in the street is completely, perfectly fine. So my first thing is to make sure that you understand the difference between capoeira in the roda and capoeira in the streets. And if you notice in most capoeira play, there's not a lot of hand strikes. There's mostly, kicks and sweeps and headbutting and stuff like that. But not a lot of punching or grappling and all that kind of stuff. Now that's typically the case, but there are some groups that have incorporated that into their games. So I would say so. After if you have a clear understanding that that the harder and the street are two different things, then my next thing would say is with the skills that you learn in the harder, primarily how to dodge and flip and avoid strikes, I would say practice those against people who are striking you in ways that you're not used to. So practice, avoiding punches, practice, avoiding, leg kicks and, other types of strikes that you may not necessarily encounter in the harder. I would say that's the next step to go. Also, I would say, make sure that how to hit something, how to use your kicks and how to, break rhythm. That's kind of the thing and it goes back to the music. Like the music is set up to teach a very cooperative type of flow, within the movement. But also within the lesson of the music, there are these syncopated rhythms that teach broken rhythm. And I think that for us learning how to fight with it and apply it, it's very important to understand the broken rhythm that exists within that main bass rhythm. So hitting some stuff, practicing your sweeps and your kicks against, targets, practicing your sweeps and kicks against, moving non-compliant targets would all really help. Third thing is, it's kind of like the situation with Savate in the 1800s. Savate had a bunch of kicks. They didn't have any hand strikes, not hardly any. So they had to blend Savate with English boxing. And this is where we get, our modern, Savate today. So I would suggest that same thing. It's like, if you know that with Capoeira that there's going to be a deficiency in hands, boxing is a great bridging art that you can use to help you set up your sweeps and your takedowns. Knowing how to avoid getting punched, which is probably going to be one of the worst things that you're going to have to deal with, along with, if I was to prioritize fighting in the streets with empty hand, I would say you have to worry about getting punched and worried about someone, grabbing hold of you. So then I would say, also learn how to deal with the boxer, either by learning how to box yourself and apply it to your capoeira, or, seeing what strategies you can use as a capoeirista to nullify a boxer, and then do the same thing for grappling. Like, how well can you avoid being, grabbed? What do you have at your, disposal to help you, help prevent you from being taken down? Those would be some important, elements to kind of developing, to bridging that gap between we're playing in the harder and now I'm actually expressing, doing, applying it for combat. But it's just, you have to be able to go from different modes. So you necessarily, when you go square up against someone to fight, you're not necessarily going to turn on your jam box and start doing your Ginga and then, fight from there. Some people can really fight from a Ginga. They can really fight as they move inside the harder. But for some of us, we have to take the lessons from the Ginga, which is, being able to fight from any and every position that your body is in. 'Cause that's really what the Ginga is imitating, just being in a constant state of movement. So even if my feet aren't moving, but my body, my head is moving, my shoulders are moving, I'm still within my Ginga. I'm still keeping that same rhythm. So it's it's another thing. It's it's so much weaponize your Ginga, make your Ginga, into something that is supposed to be something that it's expressive, but it allows you to move and put your body wherever you want it to. So take your Ginga into that. Don't just do the regular triangle step. Try to figure out different ways to integrate it into to a non-harder situation. I mean, I think one of the Gracies said, one of the early Gracies said, to one of these guys that were fighting against capoeiristas, in Brazil, and he was making remarks about capoeira. He said all that capoeiristas need to do, as far as fighting, is to fight, because they were already fighting at the time. But that was what his advice was they need to fight in these venues more. And so I would suggest those things. Get a sparring partner, and, put some gloves on and, work on moving with someone that comes from a different system. Like, move with someone from a different system. I just saw this thing. I'm sorry, I'm going on. They have these real hard fights. Certain groups, they do these full contact hardas. And what it ends up being is like these two guys they're kind of tentatively doing the Jenga together, but they know that the moment that they actually open themselves, that the person is going to take advantage of that, and they're just going to come in and kick them or slap them, and they'll start grappling. And so for me, when I look at that, it's like I get to these young guys, they want to actually experience their art as a fighting art, but I really think that doing it that way is misguided. It's to me, it's trying to force, a circular peg in a square hole. It's like the harder is the harder. Keep it as that. If you want to fight with someone and try out your techniques, forget about doing it inside of a harda, because these are other capoeiristas. This is almost like looking at the old magazines when they show techniques against karate people when you're fighting against. Show me something against someone else. Capoeiristas definitely need to do that more. We need to see those same movements. Go do a Sanshao match. It would be perfect. You can punch, you can kick, you can sweep, you can do takedowns. It's not really any ground fighting. That'd be a perfect place for capoeiristas to kind of develop their kicks, develop their sweep, deal with someone who's trying to punch him, deal with someone who's trying to grab him and throw him. That'd be excellent. So I would suggest more stuff like that. Get a partner who's gonna punch and kick with you, and work on and see what you can do. You have to experiment. Everyone's interpretation of the fight is going to be different. Some people are going to be heavy kickers. Some people like myself, I like to kick, but I also like doing the takedowns. I like doing the sweeps and stuff. So it's that's kind of where I like to come from. Some people may come from a totally different perspective. But the point is hit some stuff, divorce yourself from, realize there's two capoeiras, and know when you're inside the harda, you're respecting ritual. When you're outside the harda, you're fighting according to the rules of the sparring match you're in, or rules of the street, or whatever the case may be. Be prepared to deal with hands. Be prepared to deal with a grappler. I think once those things are done, you're going to see a phenomenal change in your game, and less of some of the ego stuff that happens inside the harda, because you get guys that want to show themselves how strong they are, but they use the harda as this way to do it, but it's not really the place to do it. Put some gloves on, get a mouthpiece, go deal with someone trying to clinch you, and then come and talk to me.
Well, that's great advice, Taman. I want to thank you for, again, being on the show and sharing your insights with us on this beautiful martial art. Can you tell us real quickly before you go, if somebody wants to bring you out for a seminar, if somebody wants to get in touch with you locally to come take classes with you, how can people find you on the web?
Well, if you go to silentsword.org or austinwarriorarts.com, you'll find my information. You can find me also on Facebook as Damon, D-A apostrophe M-O-N-S-T-I-T-H. The same name. You can find me on YouTube. I have some few training videos up. And, it has all my information, my email, and my telephone number. And that's probably the best way to get in touch with me.
Great. Well, again, thank you very much, Damon. It was great having you on, and hopefully we'll get you on in the future.
Okay. Thank you again.